Been going through the book of Deuteronomy together, and this morning we find ourselves in chapter 14. I just want to give a little bit of a background. Hopefully I won't spend the whole 40 minutes or whatever giving background, but Deuteronomy is a book that means second law, and it's not really a second law, it's the second giving of the law, where we saw Moses and the children of Israel be delivered from Egypt, and then they went to Sinai, Mount Sinai, or Mount Horeb as it's called as well in Scripture, and God gave Moses the law for the children of Israel to follow, and we saw that back, right after they came out of Egypt. And then after a time, he told them, I want you to go and go into the promised land. And so they went, and Moses said, well, it's a good idea for us to send in spies to see what is ahead of us, to make a plan to go in and conquer the land. And so he sent in 12 spies, one from each tribe of Israel. And we know that when they came back, all the spies agreed that the land was rich and flowing with milk and honey, and it was bountiful with blessings. And two of them said, we can go in and we can conquer this land. We can conquer these people. And 10 of them said, no, we can't do this. We're like grasshoppers to these giants that are in the land. There's no way we're going to be able to go in and do this. And so Moses agreed. They decided not to go into the land, and so God said, well, you're going to wander for 40 years in the wilderness until this generation dies off, except for the two spies that said that they could go in, Joshua and Caleb. And so they wandered in the wilderness for that 40 years, and that generation died off. And it wasn't just of old age. We see many places where God judged these people who had decided not to trust him, not to obey him and go into the land. And so after 40 years, 38 years after Sinai, actually, and so after 40 years after leaving Egypt, here they are back at the Jordan, about to go into the land. And now we have the children of that first generation. And so Moses here is giving this second telling of the law to this generation. They're just on the precipice of going into the land. And of course, as we go through the book, we'll see Moses doesn't go into the land. He pleads with God to allow him to go in, but God says no. And so Moses, gives them the law, and then he goes up onto the mountain and he dies, or we're really not given a lot of details about what happens to him, but he dies, and then Joshua leads the people into the land. And so here we are, and Moses is telling these that were maybe some of them were born under 20 years old at Mount Sinai, but they weren't like steeped in the law. Maybe some of them many weren't even born yet. And so here they are, and Moses is telling them of the law. And so we saw in Deuteronomy chapter 5, we saw where Moses gave them the 10 commandments. And now here we are starting in chapter 12 and going through, I think it's like 26, we see Moses giving them the law, the whole law. And there's a lot of ways that you can break that down, but the way I see the law is that the sections of the law really correspond to each of the 10 commandments. So last week, we took the first two commandments together in chapters 12 and 13, and thou shalt have no other God before me, and thou shalt not make unto thee any graven images. And so we saw the law that really they were to go in and destroy all of the other altars that these peoples that were there before them had built to their gods, and they were to have nothing to do with that. They were to utterly destroy the peoples, because God did not want the children of Israel, his chosen people, to pick up any of these ways of worshiping that were not the ways that he chose to be worshiped. And he said, I want to be worshiped. You will worship me in the place that I choose and essentially in the way that I choose. And so it had nothing to do with the ways of these other peoples. And so now we come to chapter 14. And chapter 14, verses 1 through 21, not the entire chapter, but 1 through 21, is really, I believe, a reflection of the third commandment. You shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain, for the Lord will not hold him guiltless who takes his name in vain. Now, we all know, we've been taught from most of us from very young what that commandment means, and we take that to mean we shall not say his name in vain when it says take the name of the Lord in vain. But I will submit to you today that this is really not what it means. It means much more than what we say, how we use his name out of our mouths. Of course, I think that is included in what this means, but that word take could be translated a couple of different ways in the Hebrew. It could have been translated to carry his name, to bear his name, much of the way that we have a family name, and we want our children to bear that name, to reflect, honor on us as parents as our children live. We don't want them to live in a way that would besmirch our name. And the similar, God does not want those who bear his name to live in such a way that they would draw dishonor or any kind of lack of reverence to his name. And so I really think that, and the way we speak is part of that, of course, but the way we live is also part of that. Interestingly, though, the name of God is not directly referenced in these verses, in this section. However, you'll recall, those of you who were here last week, that in chapters 12 and 13, there were a number of references to God's name. It was frequently used in terms of the place, a geographical location where he chose to be worshipped. And in Deuteronomy 12:5, for example, he says, you shall seek the place that the Lord your God will choose out of all your tribes to put his name and make his habitation there. And so his name was somewhat associated with his presence. His name, where he put his name. You drive around the countryside and sometimes you see a barn with a name on the barn. And that's, this is my, like a little kingdom that someone has built as a farm, as a family farm, oftentimes. And so, like, there's a place where God would put his name. Of course, later on in the Old Testament, we see that place that he chose to be worshipped is the temple. It was a place where God came to meet with his people, came to meet with a high priest. Because not just anyone could go into his presence. And they couldn't just go into his presence any time. They had to go in at a particular time and in a particular way, and they had to be cleansed, and there had to be sacrifices offered, and lest they violate his holiness in his presence. They would tie a bell on the priest, to the high priest, when he went into that Holy of Holies, lest he stop moving around, and the bell stop making jingling noise, and they'd know, something happened. He died. God's holiness was beyond his ability to intercede for the nation Israel, and so they'd pull the rope and pull him out because they couldn't go in lest they die. His holiness was a serious thing. It was not a thing to be taken lightly. And so in chapters 12 and 13, we saw how God chose for the Israelites to worship him in a particular place, ultimately in his holy temple. And as we come to chapter 14, this is instructing the Israelites beyond just how they would worship him, but really how they would live in reference to holy living. And so I've chosen to entitle the message this morning, "Be ye holy, for I am holy." Even though that is not found in this passage, that's really what we see happening here. And I'll read once again the third commandment: "You shall not take or bear or carry the name of the Lord your God, Yahweh your Elohim, in vain. For Yahweh will not hold him guiltless who takes, bears, or carries his name in vain." And in fact, if we start from the very first sentence here in chapter 14, Moses sets the context of this commandment when he says to Israel, "You are the sons of the Lord your God." Remember, before he began presenting the Ten Commandments, one of the chapters we studied was Moses. First Moses said, the Lord is unique. He's special. There's none like him. The Lord is God, the Lord alone. And then he went in the next chapter and talked about, you are his chosen people. Out of all the peoples of the earth, he has chosen you. And so now Moses reminds them, you are the sons of the Lord your God. It's kind of a little different way of saying it. He really hasn't used the word sons of Yahweh in this way before in Deuteronomy. So I'm going to go ahead, and I've been reading sections and stopping and commenting as we go, but this is a little bit shorter than what we've been trying to cover. Hopefully I won't go too far over today, but we're going to read the 21 verses together, and then we're going to go through and comment on the different sections, and then we're going to look at the application for us today. Beginning in verse 1. You are the sons of the Lord your God. You shall not cut yourselves or make any baldness on your foreheads for the dead, for you are a people holy to the Lord your God. And the Lord has chosen you to be a people for his treasured possession out of all the peoples who are on the face of the earth. You shall not eat any abomination. These are the animals you may eat: the ox, the sheep, the goat, the deer, the gazelle, the roebuck, the wild goat, the ibex, the antelope, and the mountain sheep. Every animal that parts the hoof and has the hoof cloven in two, and chews the cud, among the animals you may eat. Yet of those that chew the cud or have the hoof cloven, you shall not eat these: the camel, the hare, the rock badger, because they chew the cud, but do not part the hoof, and are unclean for you. And the pig, because it parts the hoof, but does not chew the cud, it is unclean for you. Their flesh you shall not eat, and their carcasses you shall not touch. Of all that are in the waters, you may eat these. Whatever has fins and scales you may eat, and whatever does not have fins and scales you shall not eat. It is unclean for you. You may eat all clean birds, but these are the ones that you shall not eat: the eagle, the bearded vulture, the black vulture, the kite, the falcon of any kind, every raven of any kind, the ostrich, the nighthawk, the seagull, the hawk of any kind, the little owl and the short-eared owl, and the barn owl, and the tawny owl, the carrion vulture, and the cormorant, the stork, the heron of any kind, the hoopoe, I don't know how to pronounce that, I don't know what that is, and the bat. and all winged insects are unclean for you. They shall not be eaten. All clean winged things you may eat. You shall not eat anything that has died naturally. You may give it to the sojourner who is within your towns, that he may eat of it, or you may sell it to a foreigner, for you are a people holy to the Lord your God. You shall not boil a young goat in its mother's milk. Now, this section may seem a little bit odd as I've set up the section about holy living, and yet many of these laws are really kind of detailed about what you can eat and not eat, and what you can touch and not touch. And yet I would submit to you that in both of these things there is a separation going on. There is a setting apart of his people. You see the words as we go through here, several places about things being unclean versus being clean. And so this is the distinction that we're going to see as we go through here. I want to read Leviticus 19:2 as we see, you are the sons of the Lord your God in verse 1. Leviticus 19:2 says, speak to all the congregation of the people of Israel and say to them, you shall be holy, for I, the Lord your God, am holy. See, God wants his people to be separated from these unclean things. He doesn't want these unclean things to be part of them, to characterize them. And if we were to read, I'll just kind of skim over a little bit of Leviticus 19 where he's talking there. He kind of refers to several of the commandments. He says, speak to all the congregation of the people of Israel and say to them, you shall be holy, for I, the Lord your God, am holy. Every one of you shall revere his mother and his father, and you shall keep my Sabbaths. I am the Lord your God. Do not turn to idols or make for yourselves any gods of cast metal. I am the Lord your God. When you offer a sacrifice of peace offerings to the Lord, you shall offer it so that you may be accepted. It shall be eaten the same day. He goes on and he talks about, how to, when the sacrifice may be eaten. Anything left over until the third day shall be burned up with fire. If it is eaten at all on the third day, it is tainted. It will not be accepted, and anyone who eats of it shall bear his iniquity, because he has profaned what is holy to the Lord. That person shall be cut off from his people. Now, there's this separation between clean and unclean, between holy and unholy. This idea of profane. Now, we often think of this word as being something that's about language, and yet it's really much more than that. The word profane has the same idea as the word defiled, abomination. These are words that Moses uses as we proceed here. He continues there in verse 1, you shall not cut yourselves or make any baldness on your foreheads for the dead. What's this talking about? Well, these were practices associated with funeral rites and mourning for the dead. Particularly, these were things that the other peoples that were there in the land before them did. Cut themselves and shave their heads in grief. This is, we see the idea of shaving your heads as being associated with, remember sackcloth and ashes. When they had sinned and they wanted to, they were grieving sin. But this is not in reference to grieving sin. This is in reference to grieving the dead. In Jeremiah 16, there's a reference to this. There's really this is referring to a judgment on the people that Jeremiah was bringing. And there were two things. If you go back in the text, before chapter 16, you see there were two things going on. And the first one was that they were worshiping idols, and the second was that there were these false prophets saying, the Lord, everything's going to be fine. And the Lord said, no, everything's not going to be fine. And so they were false prophets. And so Jeremiah says in verse 6 of chapter 16, both great and small shall die in this land. You shall not be buried, and no one shall lament for them or cut himself or make himself bald for them. So a reference to this practice, no one's going to grieve your loss. No one's going to cut themselves or shave their heads. Obviously, cutting themselves was not something that was that God wanted his people to do, period. He told them here, you shall not cut yourselves or shave your heads for the dead. He wanted them to be different than the peoples that were in the land before. Remember, in chapters 12 and 13, we saw how God said, you'll go in, and not only will the peoples be destroyed, but you'll burn their altars, you'll destroy everything, you'll have nothing to do with their worship practices, and this was one of their worship practices, or one of their practices. But as we look at that idea of grieving, we see a couple places, and I'm not going to turn there and read these, but you'll just recall that David had a couple of times where he grieved. Remember, one of the times he grieved, he had a son that died, a baby that died, and he grieved. And actually, what's interesting about that passage is he grieved until the baby actually died. And once he knew the baby died, he got up and he washed himself and he went and worshiped the Lord and he rejoiced. And his rejoicing was that, he won't come back to me, but I'll go see him. He knew that he would see his child. So he wasn't grieving the loss the way the peoples in the land before the Israelites grieved. He was grieving his child was on the verge of dying, and then he died. And then he said, he's with the Lord. There's another time when his son Absalom died, and David grieved in really a different way then. I think David knew that his son Absalom was not with the Lord. I don't want to go into great detail, but just to see those two sides of grief. But there was another time when David grieved. And if you remember, David sinned with Bathsheba. And the prophet came to him and told him that he had sinned. And God knew it. And David grieved. He grieved his sin. He grieved that he had violated, God's holiness. And we see, God calls David a man after his own heart. Well, it wasn't because he was perfect, because David was far from perfect. It was because of how he responded to his own sin. He hated his own sin. Okay, enough on that particular section about cutting oneself or shaving one's head because of associated with losing a loved one or having someone die. He goes on, he says in verse 3, you shall not eat any abomination. Now really, for the purposes of this morning, we could just read that and we're not going to spend a lot of time in the particular text of what it was God wanted them to eat or not eat, because he called it clean or unclean. What's important is that there were things that God said, this is detestable, this is an abomination. Do not eat it. And there were other things that he said, you may eat of it. Just like he told Adam and Eve in the garden, you may eat of the fruit of all the trees of the garden except for the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. You shall not eat of it. And yet there are some things to be noticed here. One thing before we go on, the word abomination, detestable, linked to the idea of apostasy, a verse that we saw last week, Deuteronomy 13:14. Then you shall inquire and make certain. This was where there were some who were, in the city who were teaching something false, leading people to worship other gods, leading the Israelites to worship other gods. And he said, if you hear this happening, you go into the city and you shall inquire and make search and ask diligently, and behold, if it be true and certain that such an abomination has been done among you. Then he goes on and he says basically that this city will be destroyed. These people will all die because of their choice to follow these false prophets, leading them to worship other gods. But this is the same word, abomination. And then in Deuteronomy 12, verse 31, he says, you shall not worship the Lord your God in that way, in the way that these peoples that lived in the land before you shall not worship in that way, for every abominable thing that the Lord hates, they have done for their gods, for they even burn their sons and their daughters in the fire to their gods. And of course, we actually know that part of the worship of these other peoples was cutting themselves. Do you remember another time in the Bible when we saw this happen? When Elijah was going to battle, really a spiritual battle with the prophets of Baal. And they had this challenge. Well, you pray to your God and see if fire comes down from heaven. And these prophets were running around, and one of the things that text says is that they were cutting themselves. This was part of their worship of these gods. They were shedding their own blood, and yet nothing happened. And so then Elijah had them pour all the water over the altar, and I can't remember how many barrels, just to make the point that this is, if you ever try to start a fire when it's a little wet outside, you go out and you do your thing, you gather the leaves and the twigs, and they're just a little wet. It takes a little work to get that fire to start. You gotta heat it up enough for that to actually dry a little bit so to get started. And when it's hot enough, then it'll start burning, but it takes some work. Well, he had him pour this water over the altar, and he prayed to God, and God, Yahweh, caused this fire to fall from heaven, and everything was destroyed. It lapped up the water, it said. The stones were burned. Have you ever seen stones burn? It's one thing I've never seen. Yeah, so anyway, the word abominable here refers to, in one case, it refers to that idea of leading people to worship other gods. And in the second case we read, it refers to the ways that those people worshiped their gods. He doesn't want Israel to have anything to do with worshiping in those ways. And so here we are now in chapter 14, and he's not specifically talking about how we worship. He's talking about how we live. And he's talking about one of the basic needs of life, and that is how we eat. Without eating, won't be very long, and you won't have life anymore. And so he's instructing them in this basic need of life and eating. And he says, these are the animals you may eat. He gives them a list of animals. And then he gives them a a rule, a template, if you will, to apply. If it has a hoof, cloven hoof, and choose the cud. And then he says, but on the other hand, if it chews the cud or has a cloven hoof, you may not eat of that. So, and he gives some animals for that as well. I'll just point out one thing in particular in verse 8. I don't want to go through all the animals. The idea, though, was clean versus unclean. He didn't want them to have this mixture, this unclean. He didn't want them to allow something unclean, to eat something unclean. But he comes to the one that we all know about, the pig. And just want you to realize that the pig was something that was associated with the worship of the other gods. They would sacrifice pigs. And then I want you to recall one thing that happened when Jesus was on earth. When, if you remember, the demoniac that had one who had said, "What's your name?" And they said, "We are legion, we are many." And so Jesus was going to cast him out, and they said, "Please cast us into something else." So what did Jesus cast them into? He cast them into pigs. I don't know if there's a theological tie in there or not, but I find that very interesting. And then, of course, what did the pigs do? They were essentially sacrificed. They ran off the cliff as a result of having these demons in them. Okay, well, we'll just kind of leave that as an exercise for the student. How's that? We're all students here, by the way. Goes on in verse 9, and he says, talks now about things that are in the water. He says, "Of all that are in the waters you may eat whatever has fins and scales you may eat. Whatever does not have fins and scales, you shall not eat of it, for it is unclean for you." Now, I've heard people talk about the things that don't have scales and how, they tend to be the bottom dwellers, don't they? Not all of them, but many of them. And in fact, I've heard shrimp referred to as the cockroaches of the sea. Well, I don't know specifically why God labeled these as clean versus unclean, but he did. And that's really the important part. One interesting thing that I read was that sharks would have been included in what was unclean because they did not have scales. So if you think about the sharks, they may have eaten things that were unclean. They may have eaten, they eat a lot of things, but, and of course, as we get to the birds in the next section, it says you may eat all clean birds. These are the ones that you shall not eat: the eagle, the bearded vulture, the black vulture, the kite, the falcon of any kind, the raven. Goes on. And some of these were, carnivorous, and they would be eating things potentially that were unclean. And I just have to think that there was a relationship there. I don't know for sure. The Bible doesn't tell us exactly why God said these things are clean and these things are unclean. I really think that's not the point. And if we spend too much time on trying to understand what was in each category and why, then we miss the point that God wanted a distinction. He wanted his people to be clean. He wanted his people to be pure. He wanted their lifestyle to reflect his own holiness. Be ye holy, for I am holy. It says in verse 21, you shall not eat of anything that has died naturally. Well, if you see something, if you go out and let's say you're raising cows, you go out and you see a cow died, wasn't dead yesterday, is dead today. Well, you probably don't want to have anything to do with that meat. It probably isn't wise because you don't know what it died of. may have a disease. You don't want to eat that meat. Plus, you know, the blood is still in the meat, and God told them specifically in chapter 1 when he was talking about sacrifices, drain the blood out on the ground. Don't eat the blood. Don't leave it in the carcass, drain it out on the ground. Pour it out like water. Because, well, he says the life is in the blood. And we know that, we talked about last week, the bacteria, if you leave the blood in the animal, then the bacteria starts to grow and it's not going to be good. So he says, you can kill an animal and eat it, sacrifice it and eat it, but you can't, if you come across an animal that's died naturally, you can sell it to a foreigner. You can allow a sojourner. This idea of sojourner was someone who's traveling and they didn't have hotels, so you'd say, well, you're traveling through, you can stay at our house, that kind of thing. You can give it to a sojourner, but you will not eat of it, he says. You can even, make a profit on it. That's not a problem, but he says, you will not eat of it because it's unclean. And then he goes on and he says, he calls back this idea that we saw in verse 1. He says, for you are a people holy to the Lord your God. Holy, set apart, pure to Yahweh your Elohim. See, these other peoples that were in the land had worshipped their own gods. Remember, you shall have no other Elohim before me. They had worshipped their own gods. But every time Moses says, Yahweh, your Elohim, he's saying you have a unique, a special, a most high God above all other gods. Remember verse 1, you are the sons of the Lord your God. Verse 2, you are a people holy, set apart to the Lord your God. The Lord has chosen you to be a people for his treasured possession out of all the peoples who are on the face of the earth. And now in verse 21, for you are a people holy to the Lord your God. All of this section, though it seems to be about, what you can eat and whether you can, touch a dead, something dead. No, it's not so much about that as it is about being holy, being set apart, being clean versus unclean. And now he concludes with maybe something that's a little bit seems out of place. It's like we see this nice bookend about you are a people holy to the Lord your God. And then we read, you shall not boil a young goat in its mother's milk. And of course, just think about that for a minute. Boil a young goat in its mother's milk. This is, in a sense, a mixture of life with death. We see this life-giving milk of the mother that was supposed to feed and nurture this young goat. And rather than being used to feed and nurture this young goat, it's being used as a, to boil, to kill the young goat. It's a mixture God didn't intend. And he calls it, he doesn't say it's unclean, but he groups it here with this idea of this being unclean. It's unnatural. It's against his design. He's not saying you couldn't boil a goat in another goat's milk. He's specifically talking about the mother of the goat and, a baby goat, a kid. So, really a lot of this section is drawing a distinction. And you think about even the idea that we started off with of cutting oneself, and they were literally, until blood gushed out, they were shedding their own blood. What good did that do? Hebrews tells us that without the shedding of blood, there's no remission of sin, and yet shedding their own blood did no good. Even shedding the blood of, bulls and goats in the Old Testament, sacrifices, did not pay for their sin. It merely covered their sin as a temporary covering until Jesus would come and he would die on the cross as the Lamb of God, and his blood would be shed to wash away, to pay for our sin. He became sin for us who knew no sin. He knew no sin. He never sinned. And yet he became sin so that we might become the righteousness of God in him. So that when God sees us, he could see Christ's righteousness. And what would cause that exchange to happen? When we accept him as our Savior. If we do not know him as our Savior, that exchange hasn't been made. Our sin hasn't been dealt with. And God doesn't see Christ's righteousness when he looks on us. So how does all this apply to us, this idea of clean versus unclean? Are we under this law where we must eat certain things and not eat other things? Well, no, we're not. If you remember, Peter in the book of Acts had a dream, and God showed him this meat, and Peter said, I can't, he said, arise and eat, and Peter said, I can't eat that. And eventually, God said, well, what I've called clean, let not man call unclean. And so God had given it to Peter to eat. He had showed him that you're really missing the point about clean and unclean, and I'm allowing you now to eat these things that previously you couldn't eat. Because it wasn't so much about those animals, about that clean versus unclean, as it was about holiness and about God and the way that he wants us to live, and that he wants us to bear his name with reverence, respect, with really the way we want our children to bear our names. We'll close with Romans 12, 1 and 2, where Paul is talking to the Romans, and he says, I appeal to you, therefore, brothers, fellow Christians, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your spiritual worship. Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind, that by testing you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect. And so essentially what Paul is saying is the same thing that God was saying when he said not to take his name in vain, not to bear his name in vain. We as believers bear his name. We're called Christians. It comes from Christ ones that follow Christ, ones that seek to live as Christ lived. We make a cool little bracelet. What did Jesus do? What would Jesus do? Because we want to, keep that at top. What would Jesus do in each situation? God wants us to live holy lives, not in order to earn salvation, but because we already have it. Remember that the children of Israel had been delivered from Egypt before the giving of the law. The law was not about, earning his favor. It wasn't about that. He already had chosen them. He had already given them his favor. And that coming, deliverance from Egypt is analogous to our salvation. The living in the land is analogous to our lives that we live as believers in this broken and fallen world. And he wants us to live holy. He wants us to not bear or carry his name in vain. May we, as we leave this place this morning, may we be challenged in each situation, in each opportunity that we have, interaction with people, choices that we make. May we bear his name with the reverence that is due. Let's close in a word of prayer.